Jamus Lim.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this debate. Before I continue, I wish to declare that I'm an educator at an institution of higher education, delivering courses in international trade and finance. Last month, Ministers Ong and Tan provided thoughtful expositions about the benefits of free trade for economic growth and prosperity, and Professor Hoon has just done the same. Mr. Ong has also shared with us his perspective, which I'm convinced is deeply embedded in his intellectual DNA as a trade negotiator, while simultaneously exposing us to the delicacy that is Samsu. He also clearly articulated that the government's position that anxieties on jobs, while legitimate, are distinct from both free trade agreements in general and CECA in particular. In my contribution to this motion, I will argue against the blanket claim that the precarity felt by our workers has absolutely nothing to do with free trade or, for that matter, free trade agreements. The proposition that free trade is a net positive for national welfare has long and illustrious roots dating back to the 18th and early 19th century. In my courses, I teach this idea in my very first lecture, that countries are better off when they specialize and trade instead of trying to take on the burden of producing everything within its own borders. This is the case even for an advanced economy in possession of technological capabilities to produce all manner of goods more efficiently than others can. The conclusion is counterintuitive, but once one embraces the logic, it is incontrovertible, and the insight deeply satisfying. Indeed, this insight has been characterized as both non-trivial and elusive. In my second lecture, however, my students quickly learn that free trade is not an unadorned good. Even in the simplest of models, trading relationships between two countries will throw up both winners and losers. In general, for capital-rich, advanced economies, the gainers will, unsurprisingly, be industry, leaving the lot of workers worse off. By similar token, higher skilled labor in developed countries tend to benefit from trade opening, while the lower skilled ones are often left behind. But this unequal outcome need not be the death knell for free trade. In the long run, as workers displaced by trade find new jobs and reallocate to in-demand sectors, wages and employment will even out. Furthermore, since the gains outweigh the losses, it is entirely possible for winners, in this case capitalists, or higher skilled professionals, to compensate the losers, the workers, at least in part. Doing so leaves everyone better off and helps ease the transition to a more liberal trading regime. And there you have it. The case for free trade, which has survived many generations and of subsequent elaborations with bells and whistles thrown in. Thus, as long as we keep in mind the pressing need to ease the distributional consequences, we can always build a national consensus in support of trade liberalization. Alas, in the real world that we inhabit, many policymakers have often forgotten this important imperative. So, globally, the pursuit of trading relations has often left parties to fend for themselves, losing parties to fend for themselves. When Singapore was a relatively poor, underdeveloped economy, this mattered a lot less. After all, the gainers in this case were our masses of low-skilled labor, hungry for jobs and opportunities that will be ushered in by embracing globalization. With so little to lose, it was straightforward to build a large coalition in support of free trade. But we are no longer poor, and this complicates matters. Today, the major gainers in our nation's stance on free trade are the high-skilled and those with access to capital. These groups benefit disproportionately well from our open trading regime, leaving our less well-off working class, now decidedly the minority, in an even worse position. It should therefore be of little surprise that all over the world, we have witnessed populist challenges to globalization, from the 1999 Seattle WTO protests to the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement to the more recent Gilets jaunes in France. And Mr. Speaker, may I venture that the backlash against CECA also has its roots in the perceived inequality of the deal for our local workers. After all, this all comes down to the recognition that free trade and free trade agreements are hardly the same thing. Many of these agreements have been concluded with insufficient attention to the distributional consequences for the minority that has been hard done by the deal. As a result, we have ventured from the rules of thumb on compensation that economists have routinely advocated to secure support for free trade. Now, to be completely fair to governments worldwide, including this one, the standard prescription on compensation has not been completely ignored. The United States first enacted the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The EU created a Globalization Adjustment Fund in 2007. Closer to our neighborhood, South Korea rolled out an adjustment program targeted at SMEs that same year. But in many instances, these programs do not go far enough. Qualification criteria for assistance tend to be stringent, and those who ultimately benefit from such programs turn out to be only a fraction of those who have lost jobs. Some programs are not even specifically targeted at displacement due to trade, and as a result underemphasize the importance of retraining and reskilling. Our equivalent program is WSG and Skills Future, although these are not explicitly targeted at addressing trade-related job displacement alone. I have previously spoken during this year's Committee of Supply debates on potential refinements of our reskilling and re-employment programs, including rolling out redundancy insurance and making the jobs growth incentive and professional conversion program permanent features of our policy landscape. Other Workers' Party colleagues have also spoken of challenges faced by our workers as they adapt to challenges wrought by trade, such as our Junit MP Sylvia Lim on unemployment and my Sengkang colleague Louis Chua on expanding worker protections. But suffice to say that there is more we can do to provide an end-to-end jobs safety net that can help our workers cope with the pressures of globalization. Now, this renewed attention to adjustment costs and distributional consequences has also come under greater re-examination even within the economics profession. This was prompted in no small part by the harsh realities of the so-called China shock, which accompanied the entry of China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. The comfortable consensus in support of free trade that existed for so long began to be seriously questioned. Emerging evidence from the widespread displacement of workers in industrialized economies, especially in the manufacturing sector, where China had proven to be a formidable competitor, revealed that output, wages, and employment losses in sectors particularly exposed to imported Chinese goods tend to be large and significant. These efforts were not limited solely to sectors confronting Chinese import competition. The spillovers left whole regions which used to hum with economic activity and offer respectable middle-class jobs decimated, leaving behind armies of unemployed, disaffected workers, while also inducing declines in the wages of even those workers who worked in unrelated sectors. Now, with this general preamble on the merits and demerits of free trade agreements, it's appropriate for us to turn to a more careful examination of CECA. While the trade deal may prima facie look like an FTA just like any other, it actually carries its own set of idiosyncrasies, both in practical terms and for our nation at this point in our history. For starters, India is much larger than our little red dot. This is not just in geographic size, which is a given, but it also dominates us in terms of economic size. India's absolute output, measured in a common currency, is almost 8 times larger than than ours, and even more evidently in terms of population. One important lesson that economists have learned from China's 2001 WTO entry is that unlike the trade liberalization experiences of the 1970s through 1990s, gaining access to a massive market also means accepting entry of a massive labor force to the global economy. When there is a flood of new, lower-wage workers joining an industry that is newly open to trade, higher-wage workers that have been displaced are not as easily absorbed into the rest of the economy. Moreover, we should recognize that India is also at a far earlier development stage in their journey than we are. Another important consequence of trade opening is that over time, the prices paid to inputs of production, this is the wages, interest, or rent, will tend to meet somewhere in the middle. With the wages so much lower in India compared to Singapore, this could lead to a sharp downward shift in our local workers' earnings before some sort of convergence is achieved. Importantly, some adjustment of this nature will occur even if foreign workers do not relocate to local shores. The upshot of trade opening is that minimum salary floors for foreign employment pass holders will only offer limited succor, and the growth of local wages for those in the same sector will still be reduced so long as we begin from a relatively higher starting point. Hence, even for Singaporeans that do not lose their jobs outright as a result of CICA or any other FTA, there is still a chance that their salaries could face a significant hit if they happen to work in sectors more exposed to trade liberalization. This is our very own version of the China shock. All this is not to say that CICA is fundamentally flawed, nor that it is the main factor driving our workers' anxieties, which, as my other Workers' Party colleagues will have elaborated, is more because of our labour market and social protection policies. Still, there's little reason why we shouldn't seek to refine the deal, especially in light of the ongoing third review of the pact. Doing so will bring us back to the standard remedy I mentioned earlier, that gainers compensate losers. Do we have just cause to believe that this has been the case for CICA, or for that matter, all our FTAs? It is unclear if companies that have enjoyed enhanced access to the foreign market as a result of our trade agreements necessarily pay higher taxes as a consequence. Nor is it clear that professionals recruited from foreign nations to work in Singapore systematically do either. When all is said and done, it appears, from my vantage point, that the government has been the one picking up the slack via WSG and other adjustment schemes. Well, this is important. Unless the winners from trade are definitively contributing a share consistent with their boosted incomes, this will end up shifting the burden of supporting displaced workers back to the Singaporean taxpayer. So let me take one step away from the economics and touch on the impact of FTAs from an institutional and social-cultural perspective, something that has been shared by my Sengkang colleague, He Ting Ru. As this House is well aware, Singapore is a small island bereft of natural resources, which has meant that our success has always been because of our people. As a developing country after independence, we invested heavily in educating our workforce, producing hardworking, well-trained workers that can hold their own in competition against the rest of the world. At the same time, we refined and adapted the legal institutions and civil services that we inherited as a British colony. We imbued our people with a sense of national pride, identity, and common purpose. These did not spring from nowhere. We had to inculcate them via national education, patriotic songs, a shared history, and yes, our common love for food and shopping. Do our FTAs and labour market policies that encourage large immigration flows compromise these key contributors to our past prosperity? While the jury is still out, there are concerns about the entry of workers with less than stellar educational qualifications, the presence of a sizable but temporary expatriate labor force with limited understanding of our unique national identity, and the dilution of our cultural capital that has hitherto been so central for our success. In my view, these elements bear closer scrutiny, and PM Lee's announcements during this year's NDP rally that the government will consider gradually tightening EP and S-Pass criteria is a heartening step in this direction. Mr. Speaker, the promise behind free trade agreements is that it will lead to increased economic opportunities in both trade and investment, traditional strong suits for our economy, accompanied by the creation of more jobs for Singaporeans on net as a result. Such agreements also allow us to contribute positively, albeit indirectly, to advancing the development of our trading partners. These aspirations are all laudable. Even so, we need clear-eyed evaluations of the benefits and costs of all our FTAs, CECA included. We need to know whether these agreements have been detrimental to the job prospects of some of our local PMETs, who are already anxious about automation-related retrenchment. We need to know whether local credentials and qualifications issued to our graduates may inadvertently become undervalued relative to foreign ones because of mutual recognition clauses. We need to affirm our tenuously employed workers, those that have been involuntarily forced into food delivery or private car hire jobs, that FTAs do not open up loopholes to excessive labor inflows. All these assertions should be based on evidence obtained through careful analysis and deliberation. I call on this government to institute a Freedom of Information initiative that will guarantee the full release of accurate and complete trade, production, and labor market data, insofar as they pertain to our study of FTAs. This should be at any degree of disaggregation requested, albeit suitably anonymized if necessary. I should note that this is a routine practice in countries worldwide, from advanced economies like Australia, the European Union, and the United States, to developing nations as diverse as Brazil, Moldova, and Sri Lanka. Such a move would permit our researchers and interested members of the public to come to their own conclusions, to correct misperceptions that this government has routinely railed against. If we truly believe the FTAs have been good for our country, we have nothing to fear in releasing these data for further study and scrutiny. On that note, I support the amended motion advanced by Leader of the Opposition, Pritam Singh.